Happy Friday, everybody. It looks like we have a few people joining, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Michael Waite. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Dune Security. I'm joined here by Sheron Chakalakal, who is the head of GRC at UiPath, Chris Donaldson, who is a principal at CXD Consulting, and finally Mike Carroll, who's the director of GRC at Yugabyte, pardon me. We're super excited to talk today about an interesting paradox that we as security leaders face every day, and that is balancing the pace of innovation and also remaining secure. It's interesting because if you innovate too slowly, if you focus too much on being airtight with security, you might miss the boat on opportunities. But then if you innovate too quickly and are hasty with security, that is a recipe for disaster. And so we have three amazing security leaders here with us to talk about this interesting paradox. Before we go ahead and dive in, let's go ahead and give you guys a moment to give more thorough introductions. We'll start with you, Sheron, and we'll pass to Chris, and then finally, Mike.
Yeah, thank you for introducing us and for this opportunity, Michael. Hello, everyone. Sheron. I lead the GRC program at UiPath. I've been with the company for more than 5 years now. Previously, I was leading some of the compliance programs in Salesforce, and I started off as an engineer.
Cool. Pleasure to meet you all, and thank you for the invitation to get to be part of the panel. My name is Chris Donaldson. I'm a principal at CXD Consulting. Specifically, I specialize in executive security strategy. So working with CISOs and the executive teams on how to define what should we be doing, and then how are we actually going to achieve those objectives.
Cool, and really looking forward to this conversation. My name is Mike Carroll. I'm the GRC director at Yugabyte, so primarily responsible for overseeing our security and data privacy compliance programs, along with informing the risk management strategy. And before that, I spent about 6 or 7 years kind of in a combination of IT audit and cybersecurity consulting roles.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Sheron, let's go ahead and start with you. Our industry has been talking about the tension between innovation and security for over a decade. And when you hear the phrase controlled chaos in the context of your work, what does that actually mean to you? And has the definition changed as the pace of business has accelerated?
This is a great topic. This has been a topic we discuss every year, honestly, most of the time as the company grows. For us, controlled chaos means enabling rapid innovation in a safe, secure manner. The speed of the rapid has kept on changing over the years, especially with the boom of AI. It's almost like being in a startup mode all the time, but at the same time, acting as an enterprise. UiPath became public 5 years ago. I joined before IPO, and we were still in a startup mode. 5 years down the line, we are still in a startup mode, continuously innovating, breaking things, and doing more stuff. So the culture hasn't changed even when we have ramped up from a startup to a public company. It's just continuous chaos, but safely and securely.
Interesting. And tell me more about that. That transition from being kind of a startup, a privately held company, into a publicly traded company. There's a lot more scrutiny that you face, and just work on your side there. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, you will have to work very closely with your leadership, not just the security leadership, your engineering, product, and all the other leadership, and trying to understand what works for them. What is the balance that we can generate, how quickly the teams want to go, and how quickly we can get integrated in each of the team's deliverables. It could be as early as planning, as design as possible, and so that we don't become like a stopgap solution right at the end. So that's the only way we were able to mature as the company was maturing themselves, is being there right from the start, being there right from the discussion of what's coming in 6 months. And that has really helped us to just be on the top a little bit more.
And how do you keep this balance front and center? Because the pace of innovation just generally, I feel like, especially over the last few years, it's accelerated so much. And so if you're doing this annually, there's missed opportunity there. So how do you keep this front and center of your mind and your team's mind?
You're constantly evolving as the industry adopts new technologies, right? AI came in with the breadth speed. All the team started using AI to build more things more quicker. So we were forced to enable AI ourselves. We needed to use AI to safeguard AI. At that point, if you're not malleable enough, if you're not flexible enough, you would stay behind and no one is going to take you seriously. If you are malleable enough, flexible, and find a balance of what your objectives are along with the company, then you both will come to a common solution.
And do you feel like there's ever been instances where the pendulum has swung too far to innovation or too far towards security? Any examples that you can share with me?
I think a lot of the times, I think even with just the boom of AI, the creation of a lot of these coding agents coming in, AI apps coming in, we started seeing a lot of use of AI into multiple tools. And with the vendors introducing AI in all their products, it became to a point where how do we control all of this? So we had to go back to the board, start from the scratch, what we don't know, look at our boundaries, add more guardrails as we start to know more and more things, and then eventually mature it. I think that's what typically we would do whenever a new technology stands up.
Great. And Chris, how about you? You with your role at CXD, you've worked with a lot of different companies. How do you help them manage? Because I'm sure it's a different paradigm for each of the companies that you're working with and advising.
Yeah. So I think it depends. In my head, I kind of conceptualize organizations in like typically 3 different phases of like security, or at least 3 different buckets. I'm not sure if they're necessarily phases, like transitionally phases, but like you have compliance-focused organizations, which is basically at the leadership level, at the executive leadership level, their conceptualization of like what's important. For some organizations, it's like GRC and compliance is like the name of the game, right? Like that typically is at the beginning, at least in particular on the B2B side, right? It tends to, in that phase typically lasts a long time for organizations, in particular if you have a SaaS product, because they care about revenue generation, which is largely from a security perspective driven by getting having a positive SOC 2 report, getting ISO certified, PCI, high trust, like whatever that is, right? Or if you're in a regulated industry, it's you have to be compliant to even play the game. So you have that phase of like compliance driven security. You have the phase of you have the risk mitigation phase, which can follow directly after like compliance, because at a certain point, and like Sheron and Mike, like y'all are very familiar with this, like you get to a point to where like you do have a SOC 2, you do have ISO, like now what do you do? Like, do you either continue to stack certs, which can get fatiguing, or do you begin transitioning? And this typically happens as like organizations either IPO or they get like a Series D or E of funding, like they have more investors, they get sold to PE, and like the scrutiny on like the risk landscape like actually matters because there's something to lose now. And so executives' perspectives begin to shift in terms of like, okay, we have the certs, now what? Also, CISOs, GRC leads have to begin like articulating what's next, because we already have the certs, right? So they transition to how do we mitigate material risk, and then after that they begin to transition after they've mitigated material risk, at least the things that can put the business out of business. They have the compliance certs. Like, what is how do we manage this on an ongoing basis, and how do we innovate from an insider threat perspective, from an AI security perspective? Like we kind of get into like the more next gen or innovative conversations. From my experience, organizations that try to put like the third bucket at the front end up doing neither particularly well, because they don't have so many resources to do it, right? And that becomes very, very frustrating for GRC leads or CISOs who are being asked to run an insider threat program and get ISO and get SOC 2, and they have like 5 people on the team. They can't. It becomes very difficult. So I think that it's a balance, depending on what phase you're in, like your priorities like begin to shift, and also like what you communicate to executives and what executives' expectations are continue to shift. But security has historically like been in a like danged if you do, danged if you don't situation, where like they hold all the responsibility but none of the upside. right, for managing like all the new security threats, like from an AI security perspective. Like security's expectations, you figure it out, but like you get none of the credit when you do, because like you don't benefit, like your numbers don't show revenue generation as like a key metric yourself. So to what Sheron and said, like the relationship with the executive team, whether you are a CISO that's already on the executive team or the CISO reports to the CIO or CRO, like wherever they sit, right? Like being strategic, like being a part of the company's strategy from the top down tends to be like the most like successful thing. And then you just kind of ride the lightning in terms of what you actually have the ability to accomplish and setting realistic expectations.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And Mike, how about you? At Yugabyte, how do you manage the controlled chaos, the pace of innovation while remaining secure?
Yeah, I see it as a spectrum. And I think when people are implementing the controls, they think about the thing that could go wrong, that data breach, that ransomware attack, those kind of events that put you in the news. And obviously, we implement controls to protect against those risks. But on the other side of the spectrum, there's other risks that I don't think get talked about as much. So on the other side of the spectrum, if we don't implement any controls at all, we can move very fast. We can be very innovative. We can keep up with customer demand very quickly. And frankly, speed is one of your core competencies, your competitive advantages as a startup. That's something that's very hard for a Fortune 500 company to try to replicate, just with the requirements they have, different levels of review and approvals. So to just go right to the other side of the spectrum and focus only on controls kind of cuts the legs out from under you if you're a startup. So the way that I see it is you've got risks of not being able to keep up with demand or differentiate yourself, and also risks of opening yourself up to unnecessary attacks or other events like that. And it's key to kind of find the balance and to do it in a way that's consistent with where the organization is trying to go. So I think the first conversation you have to have as a GRC practitioner are really, what are the goals of the company? What are they trying to achieve? And how much risk are they willing to take on to get there? Then once you understand that, you start having those conversations about, okay, well, how innovative are we going to be versus how much are we okay to add that friction and slow down the business in order to protect ourselves. So I think GRC is just managing that game and also understanding that it's going to change as you grow and take on more and more complicated or complex customers, take on additional rounds of funding, all that good stuff. So that's how I see it.
I love that.
Yeah,
And I want to just double click, sorry, on something that Mike and Chris brought up here, which is the controls that are in place and some of the compliance frameworks that we have historically looked to as the kind of stamp of approval for the general security posture of an organization, that being maybe SOC 2 Type 2 or ISO 27001. And I'll just open this up to everybody here. I feel like the technology landscape is evolving so quickly. How do you view those compliance frameworks as kind of a barometer of security for an organization, and what do you supplement those with to really like be able to sleep well at night, if you can, with today's security landscape?
Yeah, I can go first because I was just going to extend that to Mike, what you were saying. We had a decision to make at the start. Are we going to go compliance first, kind of a GRC program, or are we going to go risk first? We quickly understood that if we go, we have to do SOC 2, ISO, and going on, there's always going to be a catch-up scenario where we would always create new controls for a framework. So we always decided to be threat-based, risk-based first, so that we have a plethora of risk in our overall risk register, the processes that help to close or mitigate those risks, and then the controls that govern those processes. In that way, it became an easier process internally, and then it was just mapping to other frameworks, which was much easier to do. So after a point, adding a framework was not much of a big deal if you internally already are doing much more than what the framework is looking for.
Absolutely. Chris or Mike, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, so I guess the way that when I work with clients, the way that what I found to be very easy to digest and like has worked well is like having security, like a security strategy that has like 3 pillars or 3 legs of the stool, right? So you have compliance, which is like the stuff you have to do. You have material risk mitigation, which is like in the absence of anything else, we know if we mitigate these 3 to 5 scenarios, whatever it is, we can at least survive as a business if something happens, right? Because like, there's scenarios that are not going to be covered in your SOC 2 or whatever. Like that if they happen, like the business is potentially like the solubility becomes, or like the viability becomes in question, right? Like material EPHI breach if you're a healthcare company, like very difficult to survive, in particular if you're early. So it's that like making sure that at least the stuff that will ruin the business is managed before you get into like a bigger risk portion of things. And then there's hygiene, right? So you have compliance, material risk mitigation, and then hygiene. Hygiene is the stuff that you apply everywhere, right? As like the lowest common denominator. Compliance typically is very scope specific, whether it be to a particular ISMS for ISO, or a product for SOC 2, or for EPHI for hygiene. Like it's very scope specific. It typically doesn't apply everywhere. And so the goal, what I've seen work well, and is like sectioning those off very intentionally as a part of your strategy, and then basically burning down through that list, like from left to right, compliance, material risk, and then through hygiene.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'll steer it back kind of towards the frameworks. I think the best thing to do there is to see frameworks for what they are, which is frameworks, right? So if you're having a conversation with teams and they're asking you, what does SOC 2 require? Or what does ISO require? Those are the wrong questions, right? Most frameworks aren't prescriptive, and even the ones that historically used to be, like PCI and HITRUST, now they're enabling more of a risk-based approach. And so I think the right question as you're taking on these frameworks is not just what's the requirement that shows up in the report, but what risk is it designed to reduce? And then what kind of fits in cleanly into our process to address that risk. And most of the frameworks that you're going to work with, especially your SOC and your ISO reports and a number of other ones, they're going to give you that flexibility to implement the control in a way that makes sense to you, as opposed to saying, hey, you need anti-malware on every endpoint, same thing with MDM, and so on and so forth. So I think you use the frameworks as a really way to think through risk, then figure out what makes sense from a control perspective for your business in particular.
Fantastic. And I want to dive into something that's always fun to talk about, and it's the relationship that the security team typically has with the rest of the organization. It's interesting because security, we obviously want to protect our organization. That's our prime objective. But when you look at like sales and revenue and go to market, they obviously they want everything done yesterday. They want to move super quickly. And this can be a challenging thing. If security is slowing people down, that's security's issue. And then if security is allowing super fast innovation and something happens and there's a breach or there's an issue, that's also security's fault. And so, Chris, I'll start with you here, but let's dive into that relationship and managing the relationship of security professionals in an organization with the rest of the company, and trying to establish a culture of enablement versus being viewed as kind of a blocker. How do you manage that with your companies that you work with at CXD?
Yeah, it's super tricky, first of all, because I think that not because like it's objectively hard to do, but because like the expectation management and like the messaging to the leadership team is like can be a challenge, right? Getting everyone on the same page in terms of like what the trade-offs are, because there's always trade-offs in everything, right? Unfortunately, I think that like that dynamic that you're just talking about has kind of caused a little bit of a, I guess security on its face and compliance to devolve a little bit, because people are trading off security for speed to get a certification or what have you. And I think the perception in the industry, like it's just, I think it's just like been kind of detrimental in terms of how like people have tended to handle it. I'm not sure if y'all have different perspectives on that. I know there's stuff recently that's happened that's contributed to that whole situation. But to your question, Michael, I truly, and I'm not saying this just because like I do this all the time, but I do think that most organizations do not have a security strategy. And when I say security strategy, I mean something at least on paper in terms of like, what does the executive team all agree is like the North Star of what we're going to like shoot at, and like what we're trying to accomplish, and what security means to us, why we do it, and then like what does it look like to be implemented, and then delegate it to the CISO or like the directors to actually execute, right? On like whatever, like to figure out the how do we do it. right? But there tends to consistently be, despite having IRCs and ISMSs defined and like all this stuff, like a pretty poor across the board, like executive buy-in to like what should we be doing, and like what are everyone at the C-level their expectations of security for us, and because that tends to be absent, then when something happens, like expectations are generally misaligned. Like the CISO is marching towards, hey, you told us we had to, like we heard from the CMO and the CRO that we have to get all this compliance done. So we've been doing that for the past 6 months, but now you're telling me you want this other thing. It's going to take another 6 months to do it. And now people are getting twisted and wrapped on the axle about it. But I don't know. I think that we have a responsibility though, as like the security leaders in our organizations, to kind of force those difficult conversations where things are not necessarily clear at the front, but like we have to push for clarity of expectations for the company, like top down, so that we can then build like our way of how to implement like success for the company.
Absolutely. Mike or Sheron, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, for me, I think I agree with Chris that it's a difficult challenge, being a GRC or a security practitioner. I think you get a little bit less friction when you can align your goals with the organization's goals, like I talked about before. And let me give an example of that. From a security perspective, we lean on that right side of the spectrum that I brought up earlier. We want to lock down the company because we know the risks that are at hand. But let's say, for instance, that egress control is an issue at my company, and I want to try to shut that down. If I just go by myself to the engineering team and try to add another project onto their plate, it's probably going to end up in a backlog unless I'm a really great speaker who can come up with a really good reason for why it's needed. But let's say that I know that, again, in our case, revenue enablement or revenue generation is a key goal of the business. Okay, well, to break into the financial sector, we need PCI. That's going to open up conversations around egress control. So that way, instead of trying to present that initiative as a risk reduction, that's kind of hard to quantify the benefit of it. If I tie it to revenue generation that the business is trying to pursue and say, hey, if we want to unlock deals with these financial customers, we need egress control because of PCI. I've got alignment with the business controls or with the business goals and the security team's goals. I've got a much more compelling case to improve the security posture of the organization at that point.
I love that. And Sheron, anything that you'd like to add about your experience with UiPath?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Mike. If you use GRC and compliance as a sales enabled tool as well, it definitely helps to have a commonality with the goals what other teams have. One of the examples I can give is we were looking to expand into multiple international regions. And the GTM and the support teams quickly understood that for them to expand into those different international regions, security discussion comes first. So they had to bring us in right at the start to talk to the customers, whether it's about data residency, whether it's about some of those nuanced frameworks which those public sector customers needed from those international regions. So that made us what you call like a sales enabled right from the start versus us being coming at the last end and trying to become a bottleneck for that.
Sheron, how far in advance did you have those conversations, or would you like in general like to have those conversations to give enough a lead time? So like, let's say for instance, like someone said, hey, we want to open up this, APAC or whatever, right? Like how far in advance does that decision or that conversation at least need to happen so that you like security is not actually like the bottleneck when it comes time to go live?
We really start right at the business case. Business case of we need this region, an APAC region. Okay, what is the overall ARR that's going to be generated with this business? And what's going to take for us to internally get to that, to operate that? And within that, what do you call dollar amount of operate, security, GRC, all of that becomes part of it, not just maintaining the region, but also implementing all those controls in place. So it has to be right at the start, because otherwise they will soon understand that they're missing opportunities just because they didn't have anything right from the start.
I love that. I think that I maybe it was Mike or Chris that made this point a few minutes ago about really kind of like bringing security into language that like the sales, revenue, go-to-market people can align with in terms of business strategy, in terms of revenue generation, and also for engineers, pitching it in a way that makes sense to them and is aligned with business objectives, where they don't feel like it's this onerous thing of like, oh my God, we have to do another tool on everybody's computer. We're replacing the EDR, we're enhancing DLP, and then they just give you a massive eye roll. So I think meeting people where they're at and making sure that security is framed in a way that aligns with the business objectives is really, it sounds like it's a very effective tool in terms of being able to move the needle and have security be more central to the organization's core business objectives. And one thing I want to double click on here is kind of the trend of shadow IT of at organizations. Sometimes if things are so locked down, or if there isn't great security policy and it's not top of mind for people, you'll see employees going out and installing things on their computer that they shouldn't, or doing things that introduce risk to the organization that they might even not know is against policy. And so I'll just open up the floor here of kind of managing the trend of shadow IT within your organizations. How do you guys approach that?
Yeah, I can take the first stab at that. I think the first thing is making sure that people have access to the tools that they need to be productive. Because if we don't meet that baseline, chances are we're either A, slowing down the business, or B, probably more realistically, people are going to work around us and go off of a personal laptop or a personal license, whatever the case may be. But having said that, once we confirm that we've got the right tooling that we need, I think we also need to open the door for additional tooling and not just say, oh, we've got this SaaS tool for this use case and another one for that use case. Because especially in the age of AI, these tools are just constantly leapfrogging each other. And even to start with, some are better in certain use cases than another one. And so you don't want to just lock your team into, one or two tools when, there's a number of them out there that could make their lives a lot easier. So I think the third component is having an efficient procurement process where people can go through, ask to use tools, and we can vet it from a legal standpoint, a financial standpoint, and also a security standpoint. But also I think something that our IT team's done really well at Yugabyte is they've done a good job of cutting down on duplicate tools that do the exact same thing. Because, like I said before, certain tools do things better than each other. But if you can't make that use case for why you want to use this tool versus that tool, and maybe 3 people use tool number 1 and 2 use another tool and 4 use another one, we're kind of opening up that surface area for an attack unnecessarily. So I think giving people the flexibility to choose tools that they work best with, while also kind of trying to box that into a reasonable amount, helps you kind of get the best of both worlds.
Absolutely. Sheron and Chris, how do you guys look at that?
So from our side, I kind of agree with Mike. You need to meet them in the middle. You have to see what opportunity they're trying to gain on, trying to build on, and try to meet in the middle of how you can try to guard around it. Just to give an example, when ChatGPT came, everyone started using ChatGPT, right? So we could easily detect that people are starting to use ChatGPT. At that point, there were not enough tools to understand what data they're going to use within ChatGPT. So we used the enterprise ChatGPT version so that we could put guardrails around it. So you're not dissatisfying the people, the employees, and anyone who's ChatGPT version. They can just use the enterprise version and not go to the local or the personal version. In that way, we were able to remediate that kind of issue. So always working with the teams. If there are certain tools that are going to help them to go 10x, 20x, go ahead, go with the coding agent. But let us help you there. Let us get an enterprise version. Let us help some guardrails around it so that we work right with you at that point.
Absolutely. And Chris, how about you?
I don't know. I see both sides of the street on this one. Like, part of me, and I've had this challenge for a long time of like, I think Mike articulated it well. Of on one side of me, I'm like, you will have access to exactly what I tell you you're going to have access to. Like, I want to lock everything down. And on the other side, I'm like, let's just send it. Like, let's just go fast and like, I mean, right now, I think one of the big things that's happening is folks use Claude Code is there are all these new plugins that are being created every day, right? which are from all these new GitHub repos. So like managing all that is like it's just unrealistic to keep that one managed right now unless y'all have had experience with it. Like y'all have figured out how to do that one, but I haven't cracked it yet. But that's a good example of like, but if you're now like you have these code review plugins, you have all this stuff that's like new and evolving every day. Like how do you go at the speed of innovation, which is so fast? I think the only thing I have found success in is collaborating with like the principal engineers on how to like on the common objective, because they and the architect, like the principal architects or the the ICs, I guess whoever it is, right? Like the more senior like individual contributors on the dev side or the engineering side. I call it like the grumpy engineer test of like how would a grumpy engineer like respond to this, to my request, and then that's like the filter I use to actually make rational like business positive decisions. And so when I can actually have a grumpy engineer work with me, like that's the best scenario, because I think truly everyone actually understands the objective. Like I do believe that everyone on the engineering side, like they get it, like they understand, like they don't want to do something stupid. Like I know in my own development, like I certainly don't want to put something out there that's going to blow up for whatever reason. So or be someone get access to. So it's really, I think it is like getting everyone on the same team and understanding that like they may have a better solution than like what I can come up with on my own. So I'm not telling them what to do. Like we are collaborating on how to achieve the objective together.
Absolutely. And each of you brought up AI in your own comments, and I'm excited to open Pandora's box here. And I think the audience members are probably eager to dive into this, as am I. And it's been interesting over the last 3 years because it feels like the pace of innovation has really kind of hit that inflection moment. We've hit the hockey stick moment where it's just things are evolving so quickly. I remember when we first started working with ChatGPT, when we were building Dune in the early days, it was like miraculous, and it really made us so much more effective. And today, I mean, AI is core in everything that we do, and it allows our developers to be like have superpowers. It allows our revenue and go-to-market teams to move much more quickly. So overall, it's an incredible thing, but also there's massive risk that comes with this. I look at some of the more recent developments over, say, like the last 6 months, as we saw tools like OpenClaw coming onto the scene, where it's basically running with system permissions locally. It's able to use a lot of different tools and different plugins that are not vetted, and it can introduce a ton of risk. But then on the other side, it's if we're not using AI, any company is going to get left behind. And so I'm going to just kind of open up the floor here. I'll start with you, Mike. I'd love to understand your take on, especially like the last 6 months as AI has started to evolve extremely quickly, and especially when we look at agentic use cases. How do you look at this current paradigm and trying to get all of the innovation and the fast pace from these tools, but kind of being eyes wide open with the massive risks that are associated?
Yeah, I think we're definitely at the inflection point when my parents are asking about ChatGPT. So that's a good litmus test once Mike and Joanne Carroll are playing around with LLMs. But yeah, so I think, to your point, Michael, even going back a year or two ago, AI was kind of a differentiator or maybe a nice to have. And today I think it's table stakes. So the question isn't really, as a business, do we want to pursue AI? It's how do we enable the business to use AI safely and effectively? And I think the other thing to keep in mind too is it's effectively changed the way that we do our jobs. A lot of people that are involved in these workflows with AI, they've went from being the doers to basically the reviewers. And now even in a lot of IT audit firms, the more junior members aren't doing the testing. The AI bot's doing the testing and they're reviewing the output of that. So I think that's something that's important to call out. From my vantage point, I kind of view it as a vendor review on steroids. So I'm looking at all the normal risks of, say, using a SaaS platform plus additional considerations, both from a security and a legal standpoint. Like, for instance, if I use ChatGPT and I put, our organization's proprietary source code, did I just give them access to our source code unnecessarily? And on the flip side of that, do I actually own the output and can I use it for commercial purposes? So I think those are all things that need to be evaluated very carefully, kind of in tandem between the security and the legal teams, because there are significant risks of using these tools. And beyond just choosing between tool A, B, and C, there's a number of different licenses that could impact a lot of that decision as well. And I might say, no, we can't use the free tier of ChatGPT, but we have more protections or we've got more ownership of the output if maybe we're on the enterprise edition of that license. So those are some of the considerations that I'm looking at, but my goal is always to enable the business as much as possible, assuming that we're comfortable with the risk level of using that LLM or that AI solution.
And let's double click on that a bit. Like if you're looking at, say, Claude Cowork, where it's from Anthropic, you can have an enterprise license to it. There's so many integrations that they're constantly building into that can be incredible. But how do you choose what you're allowing AI to have access to within the organization? What type of process do you rely on there?
There's a few things. I think the most underrated thing is training, because if we're just trying to take a requirement-based approach and people are putting in requests and we're saying yes or no, but they don't know what's going into our decision or what the risks are or kind of our why, we're kind of banging our head against the wall. So I think in addition to having, your basic security awareness and data privacy training, I think we're at a point where it's necessary to train people, on AI, both how to use it effectively, but what some of the risks are that we're looking at when we're evaluating those tools. And that way, they're essentially your first line of review. I think if you can have somebody who's considering adopting an AI product and they have the sense to, before they even request it, go onto the site, check the privacy notice, check the policies, maybe security posture. I think that that's a big win for the business. The other thing too that we've started doing with these AI tools in particular is approving them, but basing, I guess, kind of trying to decide what levels or what classifications of data we're approving them for. And some of the more robust tools will say, okay, it might be all right to use customer data, assuming that contractually we can, but AI system or LLM number 2 that's less secure, now you can only use public data on that. So it's not a hard no, but we can say, hey, you can use this tool while also trimming down the use cases that might be applicable to that tool.
That makes perfect sense. And I think your point about really trying to educate the entire organization on the benefits of AI, but then also kind of the plethora of security risks. And you mentioned your parents starting to use ChatGPT, and I love that because like non-technical people, I don't know that they grasp entirely the different risks that are associated with AI, especially when we look at agentic AI. So kind of building a foundational knowledge for end users is critical so they understand, okay, there's these type of risks. Here's what I'm going to look out for. Here's our company's policy, and making sure that they're empowered with that knowledge to be able to make informed decisions. I think that's absolutely critical. And I'll open it up. Chris and Sheron, how do you guys approach this? AI it's amazing, and I love to watch the evolution of it, but I'm curious your take of how you guys use it within your organizations.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually. It can feel like a whack-a-mole situation where everything is popping up and you're just trying to close it out. For me, we go back to the basics. We look at AI risk as a data security problem, because at the end you're trying to protect the data, your customer data, the crown jewels. So you go back to the basics. What are the unknowns? Sure, the attack vectors have escalated, they've changed, they're rapidly moving to a different scale. But in the end, if you look back into what data security processes you have, how that can be expanded and mutated even with the use of AI, then you're slowly maturing your overall data security program with an extension to AI governance. At that point, it's funny you mentioned your parents, because I'm having conversations with my friends who are connecting their personal apps, personal financial tools and everything. And they're like, oh, I'm building my app to look at all of this. And I'm like, how are you looking at the security part of it? So it concerns me both at the personal as well as organization level. And then in the end, if we are not looking at it from a data angle, then it's always going to be catch-up situation where you don't have enough grasp of where all your ingress, outgress points are, where the data is going to flow out of your organization. In the end, if for me, it's always going to be the case of data. How do I solve that data? And how do I protect and add controls around those data, customer data?
Absolutely. And Chris, how about you?
I think there's like this interesting situation that's beginning to occur when you have people who are very like forward innovative, and they're experiencing a tremendous amount of dissonance between like what they know they can do and then like what they're allowed to do when they get when they use like when they work in, because if I, for instance, I have my own personal setup for stuff that's not company related. I know I can do all this stuff, and then when I go on the company side and I have to sit there and do a task that I have become so personally accustomed to not doing, because I know that like an agent, I can build an agent to do it. Like that dissonance psychologically is very difficult for organizations to endure, and like we're gonna have to figure out how to like survive that part, because you're gonna have these very frustrated teams, at least on the more technical side, who want to who know what we can do and move fast, but like can't have to continue to like click into boxes to enter in numbers manually, and it's just gonna like destroy morale. But it's a challenge. To be honest with you, like I have not, for all the companies I've talked to, no one has cracked the code necessarily on how to meet the demand, like the speed of demand with like the necessity of security. Like it's so nascent, and I think Sheron and Mike, y'all both said this as well. Like the like hockey stick of like how fast things are continuing to change. Like you could, for instance, put in a review to do an actual like substantive, meaningful review to enable someone to use Cursor, for example, only to have Claude Code come out with the exact same feature that's even better next week, and then like no one cares about Cursor anymore because everyone wants to use Claude Code now, and so it's like this hamster wheel of trying to catch up and trying to do the right things while enabling people of like where they want to be at. And so, I mean, I wish I had a better answer, but I think like continuing to stick with and like the thing I do know to be true is that the more tightly I'm hoping that this brings security and like operational like deployment development SRE teams together more tightly to like achieve objectives together versus like continuing this like bifurcated function of security, putting demands on or setting a bar for teams that like are disconnected from like the result.
Yeah, Chris, if I could jump in, I love that point that you made about the disconnect between what people can do and what they're allowed to do. And I think some of the friction too is coming from the customers, not necessarily the business and their risk tolerance. So I wouldn't be surprised too if you start seeing conversations about, we're thinking about taking on, XYZ Bank, which is a huge organization, cardholder data, but oh, by the way, we're severely limited in how we can use AI tools. And I think there's going to be conversations around, is the revenue coming from this contract, worth the lost productivity that it could potentially impact our business with.
That's a really good point.
Just to extend to that, we are looking at both the angles because we also build our own agents. We also build our own foundational models. So it's not just looking at how we can put guardrails into other agents or other LLM models that we're using, but not how do we protect our own models? How do we protect our own agents? What is our responsibility creating those? So having that both set of dialogues can be challenging, but very important.
Yeah, I think the points that you guys have made about the cognitive dissonance that our employees will face when they're using AI in their personal life to automate so much of it, and they're like, this is fast and amazing, I need to apply this at work. And then also with the landscape changing so quickly, it seems like probably every 3 months, like the top tier foundational model changes. It was OpenAI for a time, it's Anthropic for a time, who knows what it's going to turn into, but it creates almost a perfect storm for us as security leaders where we have users who are hungry for this technology. And the landscape that we're looking at today, it's going to look dramatically different in 3 or 4 months. And so we're in this moment of always trying to play catch up in some ways where, It's just things are evolving so quickly. So how do each of you as security leaders try to stay abreast of the landscape of risk that is associated with this? I mean, even the types of attacks that we're seeing against AI and specifically against agentic AI, it's interesting because now it's less technical. It can still be very technical, but we are even seeing things like prompt injection, where now it's like a SEG should be looking for text and email that is having a jailbreak attempt, because if you can get that into an inbox that's managed by an agent, you could probably have a pretty successful attack with that. So it's the threat landscape is evolving faster than I've ever seen it. So how do you guys stay kind of front and center of the threats that we're facing today?
I've seen it more. I guess my focus recently has been a lot more on like skills and plugins as like an introduction to of threats. I think the prompt, I haven't, the folks I've talked to, like that's been where their head has been in terms of like, because they want to have their developers are constantly pulling down new GitHub repos for a new plugin to do a new feature, because there's like, the way that code planning and then brainstorming and iteration and like all of that continues to move. I mean, that's like crazy fast how that's continues to evolve. In particular, like Carpathia that comes out with the whole new wiki LLM model that he wants to like he's building off of, and like auto research and like all this new stuff that is cutting edge. Things are always being pulled down, and all the new essentially sets of code that are essentially bypass the whole code review process tend to get pulled down and then run either in a like a cloud workload or locally. And so having that I guess it's like the AI, like the agent supply chain is like probably becoming a huge attack vector that I'm not seeing a ton of people talk about as much that's like surfacing on my radar.
Certainly.
From our perspective, we're not just looking at a lot of the unknown questions that we don't know. We're also looking at all the attacks that are actually happening outside and asking the question, could that have happened to us? And what would have prevented that? And just replaying that time and time again and trying to build and mature our process. Because a lot of the times, the attack vectors are so new, so nuanced, and so creative that you wouldn't think about it right from the start, as you mentioned. And some of the breaches that are coming on live at this point. Not everything is gloom, because on one side where all of this is happening, there are new attack vectors. There are a lot of new companies coming in who are trying to solve those problems. There are multiple tools that now sit on the browsers, look at the prompts, and try to detect and tell you like, hey, something is coming up. There are tools that will work along with your models and try to see whether there are different direct threats along in your models. So there are different startups and companies that are coming up to solve those problems. Keeping an eye out those, trying to see where you can fit that in your overall AI governance story just helps.
Absolutely. And Mike, how about you?
I would agree with everything that's said. Candidly, I think this is somewhere where we're just very reactive right now. And I think when we think about other aspects of information security, we've got the benefit of knowing best practices. We know relatively well how to secure a network, an SDLC process, you name it. Whereas AI, we don't have that same benefit. And even for the frameworks and the regulations that are coming out, it feels like the guidance is more, oh, have you considered this or this or this? Or you hear a news story and you know kind of what the risk is, but there's not a best practice for how to secure it. So at this point, I think it's something that we're kind of handling on a case-by-case basis as they do come up. But hopefully, like anything else, as this matures, best practices will start to come to light as we get further along with AI.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to see with like the paradigm that we're currently in. Everything's changing so fast that like best practices 6 months ago, they might not even be applicable today. But I think that we'll start to have more clarity there. And I think that this goes back to the points that you gentlemen made earlier about really establishing a security first culture. I think it's more important today than it's ever been in the past. And I think that we have an opportunity here with our employees to essentially, like, we want to empower them with AI. It's not even just to make their lives easier. It's a business imperative at this point, but it is an all hands on deck moment for us to enable our people to understand the risks that are associated with that, and to understand that with the great power, they really need to be on top of understanding how these things work and how they can protect themselves. And Chris, I think that it was you that mentioned like some of the skills, the markdown files associated with that, and actually like as a human going through line by line and reading the things that are in there and understanding, okay, what is this going to do? What are the risks that are associated with it? And how can we protect ourselves from that? And so it's been such an interesting conversation with you gentlemen. This has been a pleasure. I'm not sure if we have any questions in the Q&A. All right, well, I think that we're probably at a point that we can wrap this up. We're just about at time. So Sheron, Chris, and Mike, this has been a pleasure chatting with you guys. This is a lot of fun, and I'm sure that we should have another one of these in 6 months, and the landscape will have evolved even more by then. But really appreciate everybody's time. Gentlemen, thank you so much.